Welcome everyone to the second in our webinar series on research, and thank you for joining us. And as usual for CGHE webinars, I'll first make some quick housekeeping announcements. Please note that the session is being recorded. And I'm trying to advance, there we go. And please keep your microphones and cameras off during the talk, but do turn your video and microphone on when you're invited to ask a question live. During the talk, we'd appreciate it if you could add questions to the chat, and at the end I'll invite you to ask them live in that order, or I can read questions out for you if you're unable to use a microphone. And do feel free to use the different views in order to have a better experience of the webinar. So this webinar will offer an overview and some highlights from the Research on Research project, which has been part of the second cycle of the Centre for Global Higher Education. This is the second in our webinar series, the link for which will be shared shortly in the chat. And it follows after our colleagues Jess Pilgrim-Brown's talk on Tuesday on working class professional administrative staff, and will be followed by our colleagues Gemma Derrick, a member of the project team, and Julie Bailey on research assessment and impact next Tuesday, and a session involving one of our advisory board members on Thursday, looking at open science. And before we start proper, I'd like to acknowledge the full team, each member of which have made an essential contribution to the work that we are presenting today, and also to express our appreciation for the contributions of the member of our advisory group. Today's presenters, as you will be able to see on your screens, include Dr. Xin Xu, Dr. Jess Pilgrim-Brown, Antonin Charret, and also in the room we'll have Dr. James Robson and Gemma Derrick. The project has explored the research function of higher education across 6 international contexts at several levels. At the system level, we tried to understand patterns and discourses around research policy, governance, funding, and the production and sharing of research knowledge. And we had a specific deep dive or spotlight on aspects of research and researcher assessment across those specific systems. And I'll explain in a moment what the systems were and why, which ones they were and why we chose them. At organization level, we tried to understand the role and value of academic research in higher education institutions. And we explored aspects of strategy and management and leadership, aspects of research cultures, but also practices of conducting and sharing research through institutional case studies located or nested within our 6 systems. At a more individual level, we explored people's perspectives on the importance and recognition of research, but also their experience of being engaged in practices of research generation, of research sharing and design. And they included academics, researchers across different knowledge clusters, which encompassed fields, disciplines, but also multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary fields. But also professional staff, leadership in higher education institutions, and more broadly across the world in different types of organizations, policy actors and publishers. Moving forward from this project, we have designed and we're piloting a global multimodule survey package, which is going to be briefly described towards the end of this presentation. So here are the 6 systems that we've looked at, and we selected them because we wanted to shine the spotlight on research and researcher assessment and feed into ongoing debates within the UK and internationally around the reform of research assessment and doing it more responsibly for the future. So we selected 6 systems that had established mechanisms for formal assessment of research, and where there was some level of, or there had been some level of resource allocation associated with performance-based retrospective assessments of research. And they included the UK, Norway, Hong Kong, Australia, New Zealand, and Italy. But as you can see, there are some markers around the world. And I think we've been economical with our markers because we have had interviews with colleagues based in a broader range of countries across the world to try and understand more broadly the context and the dynamics of global science and global research. And this is my kind of final introductory slide to try and explain what the design consisted of. We had 3 phases with comparative mapping and analysis in the first phase that involved quite an extensive policy analysis in, I think, 3 or 4 languages, including 308 policy documents, as well as interviews with 72 stakeholders across the different systems and also internationally. So you can see that there's a diversity of participants whose willingness and generosity in sharing their insights with us, I also want to acknowledge. We had governments, funding bodies, research assessment agencies, unions, data industry publishers, learned societies, international organizations, and so on. In the second phase, we focused a bit more within each of the cases, and we selected 2 institutions along some kind of contrasting dimensions that were specific to each of the systems, and conducted a total of just under 100 interviews with leadership, professional staff, researchers, including early career researchers from 4 different knowledge clusters in a total of 12 institutions. And in parallel, we have had a body of bibliometric analysis happening at organizational and disciplinary or field level, but also trying to kind of explore and model methodologically some different approaches of looking at clusters of data. So for today, we've selected some highlights from a number of publications which are in progress. I can mention the book, the cover of which you see on the screen now, which has been published recently in February, and that's a handbook of meta-research. But these publications that we want to present some highlights from today work in progress, some of which have been made available as preprints, others are in earlier stages of development. And we'll focus in particular on some of the top publications on the list. So I'll first share some reflections from a paper that we are preparing on doing comparative research on research. And then my colleagues will share highlights from 2 papers on conceptual and definitional issues, definitions of research and of researchers, and also from a more methodological paper on the development of our global survey package to support further research in the field. So I'll start by sharing the outline of our framework of dimensions for comparison, which we've been using and refining iteratively and reflectively throughout the project. This is a framework that comprises a number of dimensions, the first of which are definitions. So, what it means to do research, to be a researcher, what do we mean by quality, impact, excellence, or innovation. And we see definitions as discursive practices which are directly implicated in research policies, in practice, and in governance worldwide. They are ontological indices, so what is taken as being, but they're also normative markers, so what it ought to be. And although some structural elements of definitions, as Shin is going to explain shortly, may function as a generic conceptual blueprint and may seem recognizable across contexts, there is in fact deep diversity in their specific epistemic and ontological building blocks and in the practicalities of how they are deployed locally. And overlooking this diversity can reproduce patterns of inequality and epistemic injustice. Second, expectations, norms, and values frame how research cultures are constituted and enacted in different contexts. The normative balance of research cultures arises at the intersection of culturally, socially, historically rooted expectations, on the one hand, and global, and indeed hegemonic, canons for good research, all on the background of sectoral, institutional, and domain-specific norms. Structures and resources refer to particular configurations at subsystem or organizational level with their mechanisms and procedures, which come with a track record of repeated implementation in settings that are associated with specific indicators of research success. The circulation of structural blueprints, which have largely been associated with the Western models of the university, has entrenched specific models of institutionalized research worldwide, but there are also reimaginings and realization of more historically and culturally diverse and or alternative models. And this point is well supported by our data. Governance arrangements also show a combination of contrasting trends, and that includes a level of convergence, which is partly fueled by mobility of expertise across a global labor market of academic leadership, but also expresses specific modes of governance that are associated differentially with historical contexts and localized political contexts. And finally, interfaces. These traditionally have been between bounded sectors or fields or disciplines or national systems, but they have increasingly become complex and mixed spaces between dynamic, permeable, and overlapping ecosystems. The global layer of our data indicates that interdisciplinarity, for example, or innovation are emergent upon such broader ecosystems, many of which are no longer centered on universities as the key agent of research. Our analysis has therefore taken us away from a straightforward comparative matrix of similarities and differences and towards building exploratory narratives with different entry points in this ecosystem model, which we see as a way of theorizing multiscalar and diachronic features of research. This is our theoretical model in its current iteration, and it emphasizes key features of research ecosystems that reframe and mediate traditional categories of comparison. Interconnectedness and evolving relationships is such a feature. Dynamics between collaboration and competition, diversity and multiplicity of agents, challengeable multiple hierarchies, open and permeable boundaries, and resilience and equilibrium. Using such an approach, a more exploratory narrative-driven approach to comparison, comes with a broad range of challenges, some of which are going to be highlighted in the presentations to be made by my colleagues in the rest of this session, but some of which I've also summarized on the screen for you now. So there are challenges around building, gaining access, building trust and confidentiality, establishing equitable partnerships with the participants, challenges around the linguistics of it, the vocabularies that are used in research, especially in multilingual research, about managing the volume and range of data, about staying true to the principle and actually enacting the principle of trying to decenter epistemically, culturally, and practically the institutional and cultural models within which we ourselves are situated, and issues around historical and ongoing change, the kind of shifting nature of the phenomena and the research, some examples of which include the drastic reform of some of the systems of research assessment that we explored over the life course of the project. So I'll pass now over to Xin, who will add analytical and empirical depth by sharing highlights from our paper in progress on definitions of research.
Thank you, Alice. So following on, the second paper focuses on a seemingly simple yet complex question: what is research? So through our analysis of interviews and documents, we identified diverse conceptualizations and definitions of the term research, and developed a categorization of definitions that apply to the understandings of research. As shown on the slide, the first type is descriptive or lexical definition. The second type is persuasive. For instance, when participant explains, humanity is where it is today because we have research as our superpower. The third one is operational definition. For instance, some participants noted they do not impose a definition on what is research, or that a definition is up to research and disciplinary communities to decide. Then stipulative definition, where in our interviews, several people have mentioned the OECD Frascati manual definition. And lastly, ostensive definition, when participants start giving examples of research that includes, for instance, research on Jane Austen, quantum physics, etc. And next, we also identified 3 core components of the definitions provided, namely the drivers, processes, and outcomes. Some emphasize research being driven by curiosity, problems, or challenges. The processes highlighted systematic inquiries, discoveries, investigations, and behaviors in research. And outcomes of research refer to original knowledge, advancement and betterment, impacts and applications. The 3 focuses often also overlap, as you can see in the examples given on the slide. And finally, through the analysis of the diverse conceptualizations, we also find that we argued that the lack of consensual definition of research reflects the heterogeneity of research, the diversity of research ecosystems and stakeholders involved in the systems, as well as the nature of definitions being as complex discourses. We also argue that research can be seen as a peculiar type of concept with certain characteristics such as circularity, indexicality, performativity, ambiguity, and also contestation. Furthermore, we conceptualize the process of defining research as actions of power, which demonstrate values, and the results of defining what research actually is, shape how research is understood and practiced in different contexts and by different stakeholders. And with this, I'll pass over to Jess for the next paper.
So I'm going to talk to you about how the way in which researchers are defined in the next paper that we are in the kind of current system of production. And so within the literature, there's a persistent conundrum of what it is that defines a researcher within different types of literature, different administrative systems, different fields, disciplines, and contexts. In our work to date, we found that these definitions are broadly defined into 5 key areas: organisations and systems, research assessment, disciplinary identity and field, normative cultural definitions, and the varying definitions of what it means to be a researcher as defined by inequalities and precarities. Through narrative review, we looked at empirical and theoretical academic literature, existing frameworks within systems of administration and the systems of research assessment, which define who counts as a researcher for the purposes of these research assessment exercises. The complexities of defining a researcher extend into interactions within social worlds and disciplines, formal classification and contextual research cultures. Within organisations and systems, we have looked at institution definitions, definitions for research assessment, and definitions within career frameworks and credit attribution. Some universities which delineate specific definitions of what a researcher is on their institutional websites, for example, Oxford and Edinburgh, draw on key texts such as Frascati 2015. The Frascati manual specifically denotes that researchers are professionals engaged in the conception or creation of new knowledge. They conduct research and improve or develop concepts, theories, models, techniques, instrumentation, software, or operational models. In terms of research assessment, in different contexts, researchers can be defined by their status as being independent. For example, in the case of the UK, researchers are identified for participation in the Research Excellence Framework, REF, as a result of their status as independent. Inclusion in this framework is granted if the individual has significant responsibility for research and is an individual who undertakes self-directed research rather than carrying out another individual's research programme. Yet this delineation is not the same across research assessment exercises globally. Independence also plays a key role in definitions derived from research career frameworks. Other more informal scenarios also determine the status of researcher in the global research community. We note that in the scope of discipline and field, particular attributes, skills, and methods determine whether a researcher fits into the normative framework of research within that environment. Stemming predominantly from paradigmatic schisms, this determines who is seen to be within the fold of research within that community, but also the nature and scope of excellence in the research and how that individual portrays that sense of excellence. Further, the use of particular methods and skills as being definitive of what constitutes a researcher raises some important questions when it comes to minoritized or marginalized researchers working with indigenous practices and methods, and the fulfillment of particular normative practices which may exclude those in precarious positions or those with additional extensive commitments outside their working hours. Within the literature, for example, we find, as Agrawal 2002 has noted, that the practice of identifying particular tools as associated with research further isolates and marginalises those working in research outside of dominant cultural norms in the global north. Furthermore, journal-based research assessment frameworks have been identified as potentially inhibiting research that is relevant for important social, economic, and environmental systems. This inhibition is partly due to the framework of assessment being embedded in different scientific traditions, which also serves to marginalise some disciplines, peoples, and language in evaluation. And I'll now pass over back to Xin to further this paper.
Thank you so much, Jess. So, who are eligible researchers counted by the formal research assessment exercises? Our analysis of the policy documents showed that there are different criteria across the systems, but then there are also some commonly overlapping criteria, as also shown on the right-hand side of this slide. For instance, there are contractual type, employment function, residence, role responsibilities, etc. We also found that within each research system, who formally count as a researcher also evolves and develops over time. For instance, there have been a broadening of the categorization and inclusion through time across various of systems, and more research systems have added considerations about researchers who've taken leaves and career breaks when thinking about whether they are eligible. And meanwhile, some core expectations for being a researcher remained stable, such as shown in the example from New Zealand here. Despite the changes in languages, researchers are expected to make significant or substantive or substantial and independent contributions to research and teaching, which also corresponds with the literature just discussed. And now I'll hand over to Antonin.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to just draw a little bit on what we explained during the methodology section, that we led a variety of interviews with a variety of stakeholders who were involved in the research ecosystem in the case study institutions that we had selected, be it at institutional level, like senior managers or local or administrators in charge of the research strategy, early career researchers, early career researchers or more established researchers as well. And each of these participants were asked to provide, at one point during our interviews with them, a definition of a researcher, bringing them to reflect on who they considered to be researchers around them or more personally, but also to reflect a little bit on what a good researcher is. And as you can imagine, we had a variety of definitions that came out of these discussions. And out of these answers, we were able to develop 4 broad categories in order to organize these different definitions. So the first category were normative definitions, which were usually definitions which were stemming from a typical criteria coming from research assessment frameworks, both at national levels, but also at institutional levels, such as the number of research outputs, collaboration, or importance of topic. Other definitions were contextual, very much focused on linguistic specificities, national specificities, but disciplinary specificities as well. Others were focused on research practices and research skills. And finally, some very much focused on career and contractual elements. So I'll share just a little bit of aspects that were coming out of the findings that we had. One of the big questions that I wanted to share with you is a lot of participants answered, well, everybody is a researcher. Everybody who's curious, who has an inquiring mind, or who has some problem-solving capacity can be a researcher, which kind of redirected the question from what is a researcher to what a researcher actually does or should do, which really focused the discussion on research skills and research practices. So I gave a few examples below here from the quotes that you can see of some of these different aspects on research practices and skills, which could be creativity, A researcher is someone who's critical and has analytical skills. A researcher is someone who displays some form of methodological rigor. And finally, a researcher can be someone who displays some passion. You can see a little bit how different stakeholders representing different positions at institutional level in different countries reflected on these different aspects. Different definitions as well, as I mentioned, were more normative definitions, which were much more focused on coming out of research assessment exercises and frameworks. This could be outputs, with participants considering that if you don't publish, your research is useless. Impact. If your research doesn't have some form of societal impact, it is meaningless. Or collaboration, that it is the job of a researcher to be collaborative. While other participants very much told us about national or linguistic specificities. A Norwegian participant, for example, told us that if translated into English, the word researcher would mean knowledge holders. We looked a little bit more at disciplinary specificities, such as medical sciences. Practitioners would tell us that they could see people in the wider research community as researchers, as they all develop excellent health research, so not just limited to academia. And in philosophy, they focused on the fact that they were independent agents, which meant that they didn't have the teamwork capacities that perhaps existed in STEM fields, but they also had to be self-motivated as a very important criteria. And finally, for career-related and contractual definitions, we saw some elements of hierarchies appear as well. First of all, there were a lot of definitions that were coming from human resource languages, professional qualities and soft skills, such as a researcher, someone who has leadership skills, teamworking capacities, honesty and respect. And good researchers are people who have the capacity to build a team and provide support that's needed to the ones around them. And finally, in regards to hierarchies and power dynamics, when participants reflected on different types of contracts that existed at amongst researchers, they saw that there was some form of hierarchy that appeared and some element of prestige, which could sometimes be problematic. For example, some participants mentioned that a researcher and a good researcher is someone like a principal investigator, someone who can carry a research from beginning to end, generate the funding, and be in charge of the research outputs, while others had a much broader understanding of researchers within the academic environment, would be anyone who's involved in the research practice, from students to research administrators as well. I hope this gave you a little overview, and I'll hand over to Jess.
So the final forthcoming publication that we've currently got under development is more methodologically leaning and relates to a suite of global survey modules that are currently in development. The aim of this part of the project was to develop a survey tool or set of survey tools seeking to understand the experiences of being a researcher and conducting research in multiple different jurisdictions, countries, and administrative contexts. A related challenge here was to ensure that the questions had relevance in multiple different contexts, and I'll touch on this towards the end of this suite of slides. The modules were formed from a concept matrix, part of which you can see in its primary development on the right-hand side of the slide at the moment. And this included evidence gathered from literature and information related to other existing survey tools. For example, looking at convention in question construction from surveys such as RAND and CEDAR. A small insight into the first iteration of the concept matrix on the right-hand side can currently be seen, and that's by no means exhaustive at all. After developing this concept matrix, the further development process included expert input from the wider Research on Research team. And the final stage of development for this survey modules in their current iteration has included a suite of cognitive interviews with experts in the field in different jurisdictions to understand the way that questions are interpreted and understood more widely. As it presently stands, 5 of those have been conducted, with a further 5 scheduled to take place. And some of these have really shown us to have some kind of interesting insights in terms of question development for this module. So in terms of thematic areas that the module themes include, the global survey as a tool really did develop beyond original expectations. We primarily believed that this was going to be one survey tool, but it became a incredibly lengthy instrument. And as such, the key themes which are listed here now on the screen have each gone on to form a separate module to either be used solo or in conjunction with other modules in this suite of tools. And so, as you can see on the screen, module themes focus on people, careers, and professional development. research cultures and institutional environments, engagement, knowledge exchange and innovation, research assessment, and professional research staff or professional services staff. In the pre-piloting phase of the global survey development, which is where we currently are, as I mentioned previously, to date, we've conducted 5 cognitive interviews, each around an hour in length. And the process is very much focused on the practice of verbalizing the thought process in approaching each question. So kind of, if you're unfamiliar with conducting cognitive interviews, slightly differently from perhaps a usual semi-structured interview, it includes a lot more kind of quiet time on the part of the researcher and a lot more encouragement of verbalization of the thought process to try and understand approaches to different questions. And the real intention is to understand how the phrasing, positioning, and clarity of questions within the survey tool help it to kind of maintain and be a useful function as we go forwards. And as I mentioned, we've been doing this cognitive interviewing process with a range of different academics, and that's from different disciplines and fields, but also different administrative contexts and jurisdictions. In terms of the process of formulating some of the survey modules, we've really encountered some difficulties in between terminology in research across contexts and jurisdictions. And this has included key differences between the title and roles of some employees working within higher education globally. For example, there are different ways to term professional services staff, even in the UK, ranging from non-academic to research professionals. In the context of conducting the cognitive interviews, it also became apparent that the same terminology, for example, the term research professionals in particular, did not hold the same sort of resonance with respondents who were resident in jurisdictions such as New Zealand and Norway. And similarly, we became increasingly aware of the UK-centric and often colonial-centric determination of categories relating to demographic data in survey convention in the UK. For example, we're quite used to using categories such as Asian British Bangladesh, and they're only really relevant within this context. So we came up with this, we had this real problem in terms of if the survey was hoping to have a truly global remit, demographic categorizations such as these need to be much more specific and much more relevant to the particular context. In sort of a parallel concern, and to give you another example, social mobility and social class in the UK is often monitored using factors such as those suggested by the Social Mobility Commission. And those factors often work on assessing the level of parental occupation, university degree status of an individual's family or parents, whether they're the first in generation to go to university, whether they were in receipt of free school meals, and their own status of schooling. So in the construct of these survey modules, I was advised that this particular parameter would not be relevant in that many countries in a global context, and instead advice was given that this needed to be much more proportional to the percentage of attendees at each stage of an educational hierarchy, to be determined by that jurisdiction rather than a universal measure. And I'll hand back to Alice.
Thank you very much, Jess, and thank you very much to everyone. We very much hope that this quick run through highlights of our work has given you enough of a flavour of the kind of conceptual, methodological, but also kind of empirically grounded analysis that we have been engaged in. We are committed to make the work available open access as broadly as possible, and that includes publications, but also our data sets, and I think we have to testify to the complexities of curating qualitative international data sets of this nature in a way that remains meaningful, at least partially meaningful, for further use. And I also want to acknowledge the work of colleagues who have been conducting interviews into different countries and also curating data to make it available open access, some of whom are also in the room now. We'll also make the instrumentation available open access, so that will include qualitative instrumentation, but also the survey suite that Jess has described, and we very much hope that this will inspire further work. In addition, in terms of kind of next steps in the work that we're doing, we are hoping to move towards another phase of the work in which we would like to have more truly global engagement. The selection of the systems that we have worked with is very much limited by the fact that our criterion of having had research assessment, formalized research assessment mechanisms also plays into the particular structural blueprints that I was talking about earlier on, and the kind of different models of institutionalizing research and research assessment that have been circulating around the world, but many of which have originated within Anglo-Saxon or kind of global North contexts, and a different kind of engagement, which is more in a mode of listening and in a format that enables that kind of equitable dialogue and partnership, is something that we will be seeking over the next period. Thank you very much to everyone who has advised on these aspects as well. Again, some of you are in the room now. We are very appreciative, and we very much look forward to continuing those conversations as well. So thank you very much. Please do keep in touch. There is a project webpage with some more information, but also there is a mailing list that you can access from this slide, and we will continue to maintain the mailing list at least until the end of the current academic calendar year, but potentially beyond, so that we can share open access outputs as we make them available. So if you would like to be kept abreast of what we're doing, please do join the list. And finally, please can I remind you that you would be very much welcome to post questions in the chat, and we'd appreciate it if we could use that mechanism. It makes it a lot more straightforward to kind of engage in a conversation. So thank you to those who have already started posting questions. Thank you. I think we now have in the room James and Ling Xuan, who are team members. And if the two of you would like to join the questions and answers section, please do feel free to turn on your cameras, should you be able to do so. We've got a question already in the chat, but perhaps we could unshare the screen for now. Thank you very much. So we have a first question there. I'm not quite sure whether that's about the structure of the project or the content. So I'm going to invite Sverker Lindblad to ask the question, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Enjoyed listening it. I just wondered if you had done some special part of doctoral education in the structure of your research. So how they organize the education of or training of doctoral students? Are there any differences and so forth? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would anyone like to take this one, or would you like me to make a start? So if the question is around whether we have done research on doctoral education, we haven't done that as such, but we have purposefully included a subcategory within each of our case studies, which were early career researchers, some of whom were very early in their career. Some of our participants as well, and Antonin, you might want to jump in on that. Some of our participants as well have mentioned aspects of career preparation, training, including doctoral education. But I think the status of doctoral researchers has such variability across the world, with them counting as employees in some contexts and therefore having been included by default in both research assessment exercises and our research. In other contexts, them counting as students and with a very kind of different and distinctive status. Does anyone else in the team, would anyone like to contribute to this one? Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Matias Flores. Please do ask your question live, and please, everyone else, continue to put the questions in the chat. It's really helpful to go through that mechanism. So, Matias?
Yes, I'm sorry, I cannot turn on my camera.
That's
But
okay.
I was wondering if in your research you are considering the global dynamics on research. So, for example, the predominance of English language and the funding concentration in the global north, global south-north collaboration, unequal and uneven collaborations, and the research training of Southern scholars in the global north, and things like that. Like so, or it's more like how in each country there's like they understand research. Because I will think that a global survey could bring light on different perspective of the global dynamics on research. So I don't know if you have discussed or included something like that.
Thank you very much. I think this is something that potentially every member of the team has something to say about. So maybe if colleagues are okay with that, maybe we can run the team and have some contributions. Would anyone like to start? If otherwise, the first person in the corner of my screen is Shin.
And thank you, Matthias, and thank you, Alice. So regarding the global dynamics, that has been one of the key themes that emerged through our different rounds of analysis of different data sets. And that would include discussions about the power dynamics, inequalities, colonization of knowledges, etc., the issues. And also within each research system, we've also focused and tried to explore the dynamics with the engagement of indigenous research in a way that is related to the inequality issues and colonization issues. And also in the interviews with stakeholders internationally, we've been engaging with key stakeholders from international organizations, some of whom are based from the so-called global South, and they've been providing insights about the different structures of research systems, the inequality and equal distributions of resources, epistemic injustice across the international research engagement.
Thank you, Shin. Shall we go next to James? Is that okay, James?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Alice. Thanks, Matthias, for highlighting this really important point. I think it's something that has sat underneath the research from the beginning and formed part of our discussions as a team on an ongoing basis. I think what's really important is that the kind of dynamics that you highlight sit and exist at global level, at national levels, at institutional levels, and play out at individual levels as well. And so through the design, we've tried to capture that multi-level understanding of power, I suppose, to a certain extent. And so through the research process, I think we've tried to capture those dynamics as well as other dynamics of power and power relations across all of those different levels to understand exactly how they're playing out through the lens of research, if that makes sense.
Many thanks, James. We'll go next to Antonin and then Jess and Lingshuan, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you very much for the question. I'll just bounce back a little bit on what Sin explained. So in different of the case study institutions, we did look at the role of indigenous cultures and indigenous practices in the research environment, which was very interesting and very variable based on the different institutions that we looked at, particularly between Norway, New Zealand, or Australia. So that was a very interesting findings that came out of this. And in regards to the global dynamics as well, there were a lot of aspects coming out linked to mobility of researchers and imperatives for mobility of researchers that they were mentioning. So yeah, I'll hand over to Jess.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Matthias. And I think also just to echo what my colleagues have said, we're also trying to embed this in the development of our global survey modules. Like, it's very, very important that the survey modules do have a global remit and a global reach, both in you know, the traditional global north and the global south, and developing academics in other areas. And that being said, the reason behind conducting cognitive interviews with a range of different academics from lots of different jurisdictions is to really try and understand you know, the difference in terminology, the difference in phrasing, and the difference in kind of how we can make some of those questions kind of have a greater clarity, but also make sure that they're really contextualized throughout global higher education, rather than just being very UK and Eurocentric. And I think that is something, you know, we're also looking to continue to develop those collaborations in order to make sure that these survey modules do have that power and resonance globally.
Thanks, Jess. And Ling-Shan?
Yeah, thank you, Alice. Thank you, Matthias. And I think this global power dynamics can be reflected in many research activities, like research collaboration and also the research funding allocation. So I think it can reflect it in the resources of research, how it's allocated to different countries and different education systems. And also it's interesting to note different researchers' reactions and their agencies in responding to the allocation of different research resources like funding in this global dynamics.
Thank you very much. And I think this conversation also connects with what we are saying earlier in relation to the framework, the comparative framework, in terms of the kind of sometimes hegemonic circulation of different conceptual models and structural blueprints or institutional blueprints that sometimes can kind of constitute themselves in a kind of implicit unspoken canon for, you know, what counts as research, what counts as a researcher, what good research might look like, and actually opening up conversations around that canon and kind of learning to listen in a different way is a really important aspect. The next question is from Tung Tung Chan. Please do turn on your microphone and camera and ask your question.
Hi, sorry, I couldn't turn on my camera. I'm calling from Malaysia and the connection is really unstable. So hopefully it's not choppy. So thank you so much for this presentation. I really love the framework and the definitions in the beginning of what research means and what researchers mean. So my question is, do you have any observations of sort of the research assessment framework that you analyze, if there are preferred biases or a preferred way of rewarding certain kinds of behavior, right? So we know that open science is very popular in Europe and the UK right now, and we know, and the US as well, it is a movement that is upcoming. And so in terms of policy, researchers and groups are rewarded to publish open access. And there are also different types of research activities and different disciplines on what is considered as a successful researcher and what deserves funding, right? So in terms of funding mechanisms, there are different pillars, for example, and there are different sort of strategy, and AI is a huge thing right now. If you have anything about AI research, then you will be funded, of course. So there are all these different, I would say, policy instruments and trends to encourage and to highlight what it means to be a researcher and what would be a good research. So I just want to hear from everyone, has there been such observation across different countries, and what are their preferences so far? Thank you.
That's an excellent question. Thank you so much for this question. And I think, again, if we go around the room, if that's okay with colleagues, I think that would be a really good way of doing this. And I think if I may make a quick start, I think you're pointing out a kind of textured situation. So we have all of the different policy instruments, but also bottom-up or professionally driven trends within the broader research ecosystem. And open science is an interesting one because it kind of sits across the entire spectrum, from bottom-up to kind of very policy led initiatives in some contexts. So we have that, but we also have institutionalized expectations of and markers of success that are being used formally or informally in order to kind of legitimate, govern, and classify within research systems. And I do think that, you know, with the proliferation of ranking systems and indices and so on, these have become really entrenched and in our data, as well as I think for many of us experientially, I think we can recognize situations where, even though declaratively we would not engage with such measures and with contested kind of measures of performance, they do kind of come into discussions and assessment and consideration in more implicit ways. And I also do think that, you know, the kind of global canon at the individual level is still very much centered around research productivity in a range of contexts. And it's still very much centered on citation impact as proxied through a variety of kind of measures and indicators of esteem. That at the individual level, and then at the organizational level, I think again the canon is that, you know, organizations would have a level of financial sustainability ensured through externally secured, competitively secured research funding, and there's a number of kind of additional considerations that have to do with kind of shares of research, of scientific productions within a field, and so on. So all of these things, I think, overlap. There are the policy instruments, the bottom-up trends, and then all of those different mechanisms, indicators, and measures, some of which have been better grounded empirically and perceptually than others. Who wants to address the question? Maybe we can start in a different order. I wonder, should I start with you, James, since we've had a big hand in the presentation earlier?
Thanks, Alice. There's not much more to say. I think you've summarized that really, really nicely. I think the only thing that I'd add is that you obviously have funding mechanisms and research assessment mechanisms which shape norms and understandings of what an ideal researcher might be. Alongside that, of course, as you've highlighted, Alice, you've got the sort of embedded norms and assumptions and ideals and myths about what a researcher is and what an ideal researcher is that exist within an institution or an organization, and I think within disciplinary frameworks as well. And those, it's hard to move away from the fact that those do really emphasize research productivity, and you know, the publish or perish discourse is firmly embedded in that sort of space. I think probably alongside that, though, there are subversive discourses that we need to take into account, and a whole range of different kinds of activities which are, I think, probably actively attempting to reshape what we understand by ideal researcher in that sort of space, which maybe reduce some of the emphases on research productivity and churning out papers and so on and so forth. I think in the UK, you know, the sort of discussion around alternative ref, this sort of the hidden ref, sorry, these sorts of approaches are really trying to reshape some of those, I think, very top-down and productivity-driven assumptions about ideal researcher identity, and place different kinds of values at the heart of the conceptualization of both research and researcher. And so when we're talking about all of this, understanding, I suppose, the dominant discourses and the subversive discourses that are coming up from below is really important. And I think a core part of maybe what we're trying to do in this research is understand how those two spaces and two discursive structures clash at the intersection of research and researcher.
Thanks very much, James. Shall we go next to Jess?
Yeah, I don't have an awful lot more to add, only that I can kind of add some insights from some of the literature review, especially around definitions of a researcher. we were talking just then around kind of normative understandings of research and researcher, and there's definitely still this kind of presence within some of the literature around a kind of paradigmatic schism still operating within some fields. So particularly thinking about education, there is some work which looks at kind of impressions of qualitative versus quantitative in the kind of crudest form research, and whether which is more kind of valued by the field or the discipline. And so I do think we find within some fields that there's this kind of ongoing dispute, that it's not quite completely ironed out whether one's preferentialized over another. And I think that's quite an interesting kind of point of reflection, particularly in fields such as education, with this kind of multiple different types of lens.
Thanks, Jess. Antonin?
Yeah, I think I can draw a little bit from the findings that we had from the case studies. While most of the participants we interviewed were all quite critical of their research assessment, national research assessment exercises or frameworks that they had to undergo, usually because it took a lot of time away from them, and they were quite a bit critical of the different indicators that were used. And it's true that there's this predominance of outputs and publishing in high impact journals and a lot of the systems that we analyzed. But despite this criticality from our participants, they all still really highlighted, when asked what a good researcher is, for a lot of them, this idea of disseminating research and the importance of communicating good research. And it may not be through high impact journals, but there was really this, for a lot of participants, this stress on the importance of disseminating research, even through different means and through whatever means necessary. So what I'm trying to say is that there was an interesting, sometimes a parallel between some of the indicators used in some of these research assessment exercises and some of the aspects that our case study participants were bringing forward. And maybe one last thing as well in regards to the difference in the different research assessment exercises. Some research assessment exercises very much focused on good research proposed or quality research proposed at departmental level, whereas systems like at New Zealand really focused on evaluating individual researchers, which recenters the question a little bit more on what a good researcher is. So I found that quite interesting between the different case studies.
Thank you very much, Antonin. Lingxuan, you have done in your own research beyond the project as well. You've looked at different ranges of what counts as a knowledge contribution and so on. Would you like to comment as well?
Yes, thank you, Alice. And I think I would like to add from a methodological level. So I think in this project, maybe we can observe that, of course, for example, for medical science research, maybe, for example, in New Zealand, maybe research about the healthcare for Indigenous people are more likely to get funding. So maybe that's one example. And also in social science, maybe some researchers, for example, in education, they do like devote more of their time in teaching instead of like publishing papers. And this will also maybe affect their like promotion or their career. So I think that's kind of like the choice of their research topic and their research methods or their time between teaching and research will affect like what's a good researcher, what's good researchers who are more likely to get funding or more likely to get promoted. So maybe if that's a very interesting phenomenon to observe. So I think it's like also for my research, so maybe they suggest we maybe need more like nuanced understanding of evaluation of research with respect for the nature of this discipline and also within a certain context. Yes.
Thank you very much, Lingxuan. I just want to point out that we've had a few additional contributions in the chat that kind of build on this question. Tung Tung Chan added the example of the reward and recognition program in the Netherlands, and Sverker Lindblad referred to criteria used in Sweden. And interestingly, and in partly within this project, but also in kind of parallel interests that different members of the team have, we have looked at the kind of European context context as well. And there are a number of projects trying to explore across Europe different understandings or different criteria for recruitment, promotion, and so on of researchers and what they mean in terms of research identities and research careers. But there have also been various attempts to pilot and experiment different institutional frameworks to kind of reform the way in which researchers are assessed. And interestingly, within some of those initiatives that I'm aware of, the reward and recognition program from the Netherlands has been, in the way in which it was implemented in specific institution, has been one source of inspiration for various pilots and attempts and experiments. There is a report that I contributed to as well, but that the European Commission published recently, which is around research assessment reform and different experiments around that across Europe for those who are interested in that. And of course, we do need to acknowledge the efforts of COARA and initiatives associated with it, a core purpose of which are to reframe the conventional ways which are rooted in particular sets of norms of thinking about what counts as success in research and what should be taken into account in the assessment of researchers. So thank you for those additional contributions in the chat as well. There was also a question about Germany. I don't know, Susan, if you would like to ask the question live. It'd been really nice to see you.
Yes, hello Alice, and hello David, and it's great to be here. So thank you very much. I missed the first part of the discussion, so please forgive me if I have missed this point. I was curious to know whether you are looking at countries that, like for example, Germany is a big motor of research that doesn't have an equivalent, or we have excellence initiatives, admittedly, but we don't have something equivalent to the RAE, for example. Yeah. And secondly, are you or have you already been speaking to institutions such as the Max Planck, Fraunhofer, Helmholtz as major motors of research in the German higher education scenario? So it might be interesting to have a look at that if you haven't done it yet, because it would be, their relationship with universities, but also with the wider society in specific areas, I think could possibly be an adjunct to the study.
Thank you so much, Susan. A really good question. We have not looked at Germany because we went to systems that had, that was the criterion, systems that had an established system-wide research assessment mechanism. But this is really something that is important to explore in a different phase. In the larger research group surrounding this particular team, there are several doctoral researchers who are looking at aspects of, for example, excellence programs. And some of the members of the team as well have done that in the past, excellence programs in different parts of the world. And there are kind of different kinds of implications arising from that. In terms of specific institutions, again, in the broader group, we have colleagues who are looking at collaboration relationships between different types of institutions, different types of countries as well, and the implications that they have for the nature of research processes, output and content as well. But I think this is all we can fit within, we've already 2 minutes over time, all we can fit within the 1 hour given to the webinar. Please do join us again next week when we have Gemma Derrick and Julie Bailey speaking about research assessment and impact on Tuesday. And then we have Vincent Larivière, who's one of our advisory group members and a colleague talking about open science on Thursday next week. So until then, thank you so much for all your questions, for reaching out, and I hope that you will continue on email as well for reaching out and talking about potential conversations outside this setting. We wish you a good weekend when it starts, and see you next week.